Okay, so I have Todd McGowan here. He's recently written several books. One of the books is on comedy, and I wanted to talk about the psychoanalytic perspective on comedy and the relationship between comedy and philosophy. And I wanted to ask him some questions about his book. And the first question I want to ask is, towards the end of your book, you say that it's dangerous to not take comedy seriously. Like, what
Yeah.
did you have in mind in that? Why should we take comedy seriously?
Well, what I thought was dangerous was just thinking of it as a diversion, right? Like, I think that's the common conception of comedy. It's just diverting. And I guess for me, what's interesting about comedy is that what you just suggested, even that it lays out fundamental psychoanalytic and philosophical, and I think political too, although I think that varies depending on the comedy, insights that that aren't readily available in everyday life. So I think comedy is this suspension of, it's obviously suspension of the everyday, but I think in a way that gets us into some aspect of our existence, our subjectivity, our desire that is not evident just in everyday life. So I guess that's why I think we should take comedy pretty seriously.
Okay, so one of your main arguments or lens that you use is the relationship between excess and lack.
Yeah.
So can you maybe say something about how you see excess and lack helping to structure comedy?
Yeah. So obviously this is a really psychoanalytic point of departure, but what's funny is that I think it also makes sense on just a basic level. You can think of lack and lack and excess just in the abstract, just in a very layperson's understanding of those terms. And I think it still works and makes sense, the way to understand comedy. But my point of departure was this psychoanalytic conception that the subject is a subject of lack, that it's constantly desiring but never fulfilling its lack. And then what that allows is you to be excessive in your lack. Like, you can be, because you're lacking, you can be excessively devoted to a particular object, for instance, because you never have it. And so that actually increases your investment in it. And so I think comedy, my idea was that the comic emerges when these two things, which I think are always linked, but in society, they almost never appear together. But my idea was that in comedy, there's this moment of intersection when lack and excess become apparent together. And then that's what's the comic. That's what's funny. So it just came about by, I just kept noticing what seemed to make things funny. And then that's how I kind of got back to that psychoanalytic conception of us as lacking, and then the lack as producing an excess.
Could you give me maybe an example from a film or something or joke that where excess and lack are apparent?
Yeah, so this example I have in the film is the I don't know if people know this, the Monty Python sketch with the Black Knight who's comes to a struggle in the woods, and as his opponent keeps damaging, like he cuts off one arm, cuts off another arm, and the Black Knight he has this absurd confidence that he's still going to win the struggle. And so that, what's funny about that, it wouldn't be like if you just saw someone's arms and legs being cut
Right.
off, there's absolutely nothing funny about that. But the fact that what's added to it is this absurd confidence, like he's sitting there with no arms and no legs, he's like, I'll take it easy on you, or I'm gonna destroy you. So that aspect, I mean, to me, that was one of the great examples. But as I thought of it more, it was hard for me to think of any time when there was this great comic incident that didn't have this double aspect to it.
So an example of the night, where exactly is the excess?
The excess is his confidence. Like, he's not just confident, he's excessively confident. And that then gets juxtaposed with the lacking limbs. So in that sense, it's literally lack and this excess of confidence.
So why do you think when you explain a joke, why is it like rarely funny?
Well, I think I talk about that a little bit in the book, that I think that the part of the point is that you have to have that instantaneous recognition of those two things coming together. And if you have to get it explained to you, then you lack that moment of recognition, because if it's thought out, then there's not it has to take you by, I think a joke has to take you by surprise. And so when it's laid out or explained, then it doesn't really get you that surprise.
So one of the things I was thinking about is, like you said, like Hegel's funny, and I've like read a lot of Hegel, and I don't think
Yeah.
I've ever laughed.
Okay.
Okay, and so and because I think part of the problem is you have to struggle with Hegel, and you have to, especially his language. So I think there's the delaying of this instant connection, and that you have to make this very conscious, labored understanding of how like opposite things are related. So in what way do you see though like Hegel as comedic?
Yeah, okay, that's good. I mean, I think that's a really good point. That if you have to, if you're struggling so much to even make sense of what Hegel's saying, then it doesn't seem as funny. But paradoxically, I think that's why his jokes are all the funnier, because it's Hegel saying them, right? So
Right.
one of his jokes is that he says, if you come across a phrenologist, that is someone who believes that the skull bone is the size of your skull is the measure of your intellect, you can't really get in an argument with him. You just have to bash his head in, because that's the proper response to this kind of theory. So I thought that was pretty funny. He's talking about the Stoic philosopher. Who is it? Is it Crippius? Crippius? I don't know, but he's talking about. So he's talking about a famous Stoic philosopher whose all of his works are missing, and he's like, well, given how, or there's only fragments left of his works. He's like, given how boring his writing is, if we had to choose between having all and having none, I think having none is the better choice. So there is this kind of like, and those those aren't anomalous. I think those things are present throughout. But I think what the thing you were suggesting earlier, the whole notion of dialectics really is about opposites coming together and colliding. So in that sense, I think there's something that there's almost a matrix of comedy in Hegel's philosophy.
Yeah, but one of the things I'm really interested in is like I'm having my students write about film comedies, and a lot of them are international students, or but just in general, they're saying, how do I know if it's a comedy? And other than looking it up online and it's categorized as a comedy, it's so interesting when you're watching a film, like what signals to us when we're watching something or when someone's telling a joke that it's actually comedic? Like what is that other thing that has to be added to something? Like just, like I can say Hegel is full of contradictions. I could say
Right.
I think you would argue that, his thought is kind of structured by contradictions,
Yeah.
but there's a difference between contradictions and humor. So one of the things is like, what is a different, like, what is a thing that makes something, um, tells us that we should think of something in the context of humor?
But do you think it has to have that, Bob, to actually be funny? Because I guess my sense, like what you were saying before, like I think in the same way that a joke can't be explained, I think a joke is even funnier if we're not expecting it as a joke. And actually, when someone says, "Oh, I have this joke to tell you," you're like, "Oh my God, really? Do I have to listen to this?" So I think that actually defeats the comic in some sense. That I think that knowing or getting this preparation for a comic act coming, I don't think that's part of the comedy. I actually think that's almost a defense
Yeah.
against what the comic is for me.
So
So
yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
One thing I try to tell my students is, and this is like the first break I try to get them to make, the first, like we call it like threshold concepts, like to see the world in a different way through an idea that once you make that, cross that kind of divide, you don't see the world the same way. And so I'm trying to get them to think, I'm using psychoanalysis kind of like to get them to think of things differently. And one is this notion that humor works by the person making the joke doesn't know why it's funny, and the person laughing doesn't know why it's funny. And so, like Freud said, it's like the communication of two unconsciouses.
Yeah.
And so, of course, when I explain the joke, I destroy it, because I'm making the unconscious conscious.
Right.
And part of the power of the joke is that it has to be unconscious. And so I think that the joke is, or humor and comedy, Freud sometimes tries to separate them, but I think some of
Yes.
the common things is this notion of unconscious communication. And that is very difficult for people to accept, because people want to believe in intentionality, and that they're in control of what they're saying and thinking, and that other people are in control of what they're saying and thinking, and telling them that people are not aware of why they're saying what they're saying, and other people are not aware of why they're responding to what other people are saying, just goes so far against their regular way of seeing like communication and language and social interaction, that they often resist taking that leap.
Right, right. I think that's right, and I think, well, to me, that's what's great about comedy is that it's a pathway to what you're talking about. It's like a pathway to the unconscious, and I think you're right. Like unconscious gets resisted in so many ways, but I have always found that talking about it in terms of comedy, students are more open to it precisely for the reason you said, because they're like that it wouldn't make sense if it was all conscious, right? Like it wouldn't be funny if we were totally aware of everything that was, so it has to, so they're like, wait a minute, there has to be something about the unconscious involved in comedy, otherwise I couldn't have this moment of, oh, it took me by surprise and I laughed.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's important. Like if you think of like jokes instead of dreams as kind of the royal road to the unconscious, and then think of, you need the theory of the unconscious to understand how politics work today, how ideology works. And so then you start to see how these things can be like incredibly important. But one theory, which you kind of touch on, but I want you to get your feedback on, it's the kind of the theory that I'm most interested in Freud is, Freud says there's an implicit social contract in the joke. So the joke teller gives the audience enjoyment.
Mm-hmm.
And in exchange, the audience promises not to hold the joke teller responsible. And so the process allows one to say things without being criticized or held responsible. And we kind of see this with the court gesture. The court gesture is able to say the truth because of the court gesture's social position, and because you're not supposed to take the court gesture seriously, even though that's how the truth comes out.
Right.
So I was wondering, like, what do you think about this theory that there's kind of like this opposition almost between the joke and criticism? Because you're supposed to suspend criticism in order to respond to the joke.
So that the joke, that whatever critical content the joke has, you think it's ineffectual because the all the listeners know that they don't have to take it. They have to allow the joke teller to say this. Is that kind of what you're getting?
No, it's more like a contradiction, because on one hand, you're putting out this information that might be critical and truthful, but you're putting it out in a context where you're telling the audience not to take it seriously. And also you're actually saying, I'm going to give you enjoyment, and in exchange, you're going to promise not to hold me accountable for what I'm saying.
Right, like wouldn't the non plus ultra of this be the presidential, the correspondence dinner where they're allowed to say all these things about the president while he's right there or she's right there, and then and nothing happens to you. I think that's absolutely right, and I think that's if anything, what motivated me to say that thing that you asked me about in the beginning, taking comedy seriously. It's precisely that. Like, I think that's a way to diffuse the potential power of comedy, is to say, oh, they're allowed to say this. Like, I think these late night comedians that rail against Trump, like, once you put comedy over in this space where you can say anything but it can't have any social effect, then I think you've neutered any possibility that's attached to it. So I guess I think Freud's right about that, but I see that as a way to domesticate what I see as the potential radicality of comedy.
Okay. And what do you think of, like, Slavoj Žižek talks a lot about this, political correctness and its effect on comedy. I mean, do you think that we're going through a social period where comedy is having to change, or it's difficult to use comedy because of people want you to be sensitive to other people?
Well, maybe, but what's interesting is Slavoj doesn't use any less comedy despite him saying that, right? Like, and I haven't felt curbed. So, and I teach at a fairly, correct university. I don't know. I guess it seems like to me that that it hasn't been around comedy that many of the whatever this thing called cancel culture, whatever you think of it, I don't think that's happened so much about comic things, but more about things that were said seriously. But I don't know. I mean, maybe that's right. I haven't really felt that, nor have I seen. I mean, for instance, like Louis C.K., he was never policed for what he said
Right.
comically. It
Right.
was for what he did. So I mean, I know Chris Rock has this thing, I won't perform on college campuses anymore. And maybe there's something to that, but I don't know. I don't see that necessarily as targeting comedy as much as I do targeting behaviors, I guess.
Right. Well, I'm writing something on podcasts and like the culture of podcasts. Podcasts have really taken off as an incredible source of entertainment and culture. Some of these are downloaded millions of times,
Yeah.
and a lot of the podcasters are former comedians, and a lot of them I would call libertarians.
Yep.
And a lot of what is interesting is like free speech has been, like, you could say, weaponized or politicized. And it's interesting, like people on the right often, really promote free speech as like almost like the ultimate value,
Yeah.
and then feel oppressed that they have to censor themselves because of what they call the liberal, thought police or political correctness. And so, and Trump in some ways is like an embodiment of this, that I think part of the strategy is he wants to represent himself as a victim, like a victim of political
Yeah.
correctness, liberal culture, of the media, of his own like government, And so free speech is, and it's often connected to, for the podcasters, to comedy, right? Because they argue that, you can't be a comic anymore. Like even Jerry Seinfeld said he won't go to college campuses.
Right. Even
And,
Seinfeld.
there are instances of comedians, being attacked for saying racist or homophobic or sexist things. And so one issue is, is the left somehow playing into the right by constantly trying to censor or criticize people's speech?
Yeah, I think that's a tough issue, actually. I see that point. I see that, I think it is true that political correctness, whatever that is, that Trump is able to use that as a way to Trump and certain podcasters for sure. I guess I also think that those can be important political battles too, like making certain things not being able to be said. To my mind, there's something important in that. So I think I guess it's just it's where you draw the line, I suppose. Like, and I think that's to me, like, this question of free speech, it really is, it kind of misses I'm sure you think this too. Like, there's no such thing as an actual, everybody's censoring themselves at some point or other. It's just a question of how obvious the censorship is and at what point it is, So I guess I don't feel like it's gone too far right now. And I do feel like there is that danger. Like, if you try to curb any outbreak, I mean, that's, I guess, the danger. Like, is the left going to be the police, like always policing enjoyment, and the right is going to be this thing where you can enjoy yourself in the most obscene ways if you subscribe to rightist doctrine. So I think that's a danger. I do think I think you're right about that.
What Freud sees as inherent in the structure of humor is censorship, right?
Yeah.
And the internalized censorship. And so that, and really all unconscious formations are indirect representations because they have to avoid internal censorship.
Right.
And so censorship plays a huge role with understanding like the unconscious and unconscious formations. And so, as the censorship changes socially, then that must somehow affect, comedy or humor and the way that people, use it and stuff.
Right. I mean, what can become funny though is the censorship itself, right? Like, that's like, it's not like, I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm a great fan of pre-code Hollywood. So I'm not pre-code, sorry, production code Hollywood, because I feel like the garden variety film under the production code was just better than the garden variety film now, where the form of censorship is this muted rating system, right? So I kind of feel like having a strict code there isn't necessarily such a bad thing. So I feel like, because I think you can, just for the reason you're saying, like that, the unconscious is always responding against the censorship and navigating the censorship. So there can be I think comedy can actually deal with censorship pretty well.
Yeah.
It's not destroyed by it. Like, I think like these great screwball comedies of classical Hollywood are just better than our comedies, and they couldn't say profanity, and yet they're incredibly funny. So I think, and they couldn't have sex, they couldn't have all these things, right? So I don't know. So I guess but I do understand, like in the most repressive regimes, there's not a lot of comedy being made. So I do understand that it's not just, it's not just like, oh, censorship's no problem. Like, it can become a problem, I think.
Yeah, definitely. But there's also this liberal aspect of comedy. So if like comedy is kind of, or humor is, like Freud's theory, it's kind of like, it's dependent on the reaction of the audience and actually the pleasure of the audience. And I would even say the enjoyment of the audience, right? And then Freud like defines like the obsessional subject, as someone who's really dedicated to the enjoyment of the other. And Lacan brings this up in the idea that the obsessional is an other for an other. There's like a double alienation, that the obsessional forms its ego by identifying with another, and then wants to constantly be verified by an other, an ideal other, the ego ideal, right? And so there's this double alienation. And so you could argue that one aspect of liberalism is this double alienation, that people want to have their good intentions verified by an audience. And in that way, they want to provide enjoyment to the audience, but they also want the audience to recognize them. Like, you think about Facebook. What is Facebook? At first, all you could do is like things. And so basically, you're putting out your good self in order to have it liked by someone else. And that's like the structure of narcissism, I think, set up there. So there's an aspect of humor where you're trying to get people to like you, and part of it is by giving them enjoyment. And then the flip side is, and that allows you to escape any type of criticism, because what the obsessional, doesn't want is to be criticized, or to be not have their good intentions recognized by the other. So I think there is this kind of political dynamic in liberal comedy, and so many comedians are liberal. You can respond to this any way you want, but I'll just throw a couple of things.
Yeah, I'm going to say a couple things. That's really good, Bob. I think that I love what you said, and that's actually a description of my classes. Like, can I make give them a little enjoyment of comedy so that they don't write a bad evaluation? But I think the connection between all those things is really fascinating. Between liberal, I think that the description of liberalism is, I think, exactly. Hold on, my cat needs to get out. Sorry, I didn't know that he snuck in here. So I think that that idea of liberalism I think that's a really good definition of it. And I also think that sense of comedy, that's really what I would call that a danger of comedy. Like, that when comedy falls into that, when it becomes in the service of this liberal pleasing of the other, then I think that's a real problem, because then it as you were pointing out, it necessarily neuters the political critical dimension of comedy. Because I think if comedy is going to be successfully critical, the comic subject, the person making the comedy, has to accept there's going to be some critique for what's being said. Like, you have to accept the responsibility. And I guess that's what I feel about a lot of these complaints about abridgments of free speech. Like, look, accept the responsibility for the critique that you're making. And if a lot of people are upset with you, I think that just comes with the territory, right? Like, it's okay. Like, if you lose your job, that's one thing. But if a lot of people are just critical of you, I think that you just got to sort of suck it up. And so I feel like if comedy is trying to avoid that critique, then it does fall into exactly that liberal pattern of relating to the other that you're so nicely described. I really like what you said. I think it's perfect.
I once got this student evaluation. It said, Samuels is not as funny as he thinks he is. And I thought it was really interesting, because it implies several things. Like, okay, the person knows how funny I think I am, right?
Right.
And that I'm like deluded in my self-judgment, and that this person actually knows my level of funniness, and it doesn't like live
It's
up
not,
to what their standard is. And I've also had students say, like, I teach this, course on comedy, and I've taught it now for a few years. And in some ways, a lot of the articles that we read are very critical of comedy in the sense of comedy as indirect aggression,
mhm,
right? Comedy as stigmatization, comedy as reinserting that social hierarchy, policing
right.
people who fail to conform to social norms is a lot like comedy of morals or manners. There are a
Right.
lot of that, and then they say to me, but you're constantly making jokes, like, so,
Right.
and then I would recommend this article. It's called The First Joke, and it's about scientific theories of comedy. And I've collected like 50 different theories of humor and comedy, and I have like a list of them, and we go over most of them. But so this is like the evolutionary psychology theory. Well, they have several theories. Do you know any of these?
I know a few of them. Yeah. Yeah.
So, one of them is that like basically comedy is a way of like seducing people in order to increase your chance of reproduction, right?
Right.
Like basically, and they say, well, to make a joke, you actually have to display several cognitive abilities like memory, the ability to manipulate abstract ideas, the ability to understand other people, to anticipate the other people or what's acceptable or not acceptable within a certain society. So the theory is that when you're making a joke, you're actually seducing people by displaying all of your mental dexterity,
Right.
and that. And I really like think like so many of evolutionary psychology theories are just like a projection onto the past of like current, culture and politics.
Especially this notion of like, that seems perfect for that because, this idea that what women most want in a guy is that they have a good sense of humor. I mean, it's like
Right.
projecting that idea right back onto the
Right, right, right.
past. I mean, that's what I immediately thought of.
Has
But
that
yeah,
been proven scientifically?
no, I think it's from surveys. I don't think it's scientifically proven. But yeah. I don't. Yeah, I'm pretty skeptical, and I think that's true of most claims of evolutionary psychology that they take ideological positions and they project them, and they find because I the problem is that you could justify the exact opposite thing from the same evolutionary premises. I think so.
Exactly.
I think it's a
So
little tricky.
I want to bring this to like Hegel's theory of comedy, but in general, first your book on Hegel, right? What is the title of your book on Hegel?
It's called Emancipation After Hegel.
Okay, Emancipate. Okay, yes, I did read it. Okay, and I recommend it. Todd writes in a very clear, concise way, and always find it, a pleasure to read. And I always learn something, and it always challenges my own ideas. So I want to just start a little dialogue over the notion of contradiction. So,
Yeah.
because you tie contradiction to humor, but you also tie it to Hegel. It's a major concept in your book on Hegel. So first of all, like, how do you see Hegel like defining or using contradiction?
So my idea is that for Hegel, contradiction is necessity. Like there's no way to escape it. I think that's his basic claim, and I think he comes to this interestingly through a reading of the Kantian antinomies, that where Kant sees these antinomies, where that is like contradictions, like there is a smallest substance, there isn't a smallest substance, we can't decide between these two claims. So for Kant, this is just an antinomy of reason, and it's a sign that reason doesn't have the capacity to know things in themselves. Hegel's idea is that no, actually, this is a sign of that's how reason, this is a strength of reason, that it can grasp that there are contradictions that actually exist. So and so that's the and for him, I think that's the project of philosophy. So so Hegel's constantly undoing contradictions. If you read both the Logic and the Phenomenology, his two major books, this is the path that he follows in both, that you solve a contradiction, the German term is Auflösung, so it's either dissolve or resolve, so something like that. So you dissolve it or resolve it, and then it never then gives birth to some solution. Instead, you're brought into actually a deeper contradiction, so even more of a problem of for thought to wrestle with. So that's my idea, that his philosophy is actually moving through a series of contradictions in order in the end to be reconciled to contradiction. So that's how I read what he calls absolute knowing, or the absolute idea is a reconciliation, not a reconciliation of contradiction, but being reconciled to its irreducibility.
So yeah, so what really interesting thing I've been trying to talk to my students about is, so you have this kind of dialectical structure in the understanding of the 3-act structure of films, right?
Mm-hmm.
First, you have the first act. You have, like, the setting is established, or the character is established. Then you have a reversal, or this, something, a radical transformation, and then you're supposed to have the resolution. Okay. And the way that a lot of people, I think, critique, like Zizek, or critique Zizek's reading of Hegel, is to say, how can you say that he's a thinker of, like, contradiction or conflict or whatever, when, like, he reconciles every single opposition, right? But it's interesting if you think about the end of the film. So third act, the resolution.
Yeah.
The resolution often is actually a contradiction. The theme of a lot of, like, comedy, so the idea of, like, say, the romantic comedy, is you get two people that have opposite attributes, stereotypically, right? And they meet in the middle of they meet in the beginning of the second act, and they're supposed to, like, basically influence each other, learn from each other. It's kind of the classic screwball comedy structure. Also, is that Cary Grant, is hyper in. I forget the example I'm going to bring up, baby, but hyper, rational. Catherine is very emotional. They encounter each other, and they're supposed to, like, he's supposed to become more emotional. She's supposed to become more, rational, or, like, and so there's this article where they're using Hegel, and they say, well, what happens at the resolution is really a quest for a balance. It's not that you sacrifice completely your former being, or that you completely conform to society, or that you completely, subject yourself to the moral or to the morality of the culture. What often happens, if you watch the end, especially of comedies, is at the very moment of resolution, there's also, like, a sign of, like, resistance of the subject. And so it actually, the resolution is actually a contradiction. And that the contradiction is when, I don't know if we agree on this one, but the contradiction is when two opposite things are being affirmed at the same time.
I think that's one form of contradiction. I would also say the way in which a thing is opposed to itself, but maybe that just fits within what you're saying. But I think bringing up baby's the best example of this, right? Like the end of the film is his huge. So he's got this. If the film did what people say and came to some kind of resolution, then when Katharine Hepburn brings him the missing bone to the big brontosaurus, it would just fit in, and that would be fine. They'd get married. Instead, she causes the whole skeleton to collapse, and then she's hanging for her life, and then it's a cut. So I think that's one of the great examples of, wow, there's still this, like, utter conflict written into the resolution. So I think I almost am tempted to say the classic screwball comedies are these great Hegelian films, because whenever there's a resolution, there's always the contradiction is sustained through the resolution. In every great one, I mean, It Happened One Night, same thing. There's, it's hard to think of one really where we get this perfect, what you're talking about, like a compromise of the two orders coming together.
Yeah, but so my reading of Hegel, like, and I'd like to get your feedback on this, because I have a book that I want to write on Hegel that I've been wanting to write for 30 years.
Yeah, that's how mine.
You went there, I can't go there. Like, it's too much. But so there's certain moves that Hegel makes that I think are ironic. And I would see him like as an ironic philosopher, because like he writes a preface, and then he says you shouldn't write prefaces because
Right.
it's all in the movement of thought, and that you can't have the movement of thought before you have the thought. And so the whole idea of a preface is stupid, but here's my preface, and it's gonna be kind of long, and I'm gonna like write a preface and then at the same time tell you why it's stupid to write a preface.
Right.
And then I'm going to use the term Geist, right?
Mhm.
And I'm going to use this one term in two opposite ways. And I think this is the trick of like the phenomenology is, it's going to mean spirit, which is going to point to religion, and it's going to mean mind, which is going to point to science. And so the way to overcome the conflict between like pre-modern religion and modern science is by using this term that has contradictory opposite meanings. Like he can use it. So an aspect of irony, that Kierkegaard points out is this idea of saying something and also unsaying it at the same time, or saying something and saying the opposite at the same time. And so Hegel's allowed to talk about science, the science of the mind, but also your religious spirit at the same moment, to
Mhm.
keep these two discourses going at the same time, because he's using the same term to denote two opposite things. And I think the final one, well, this is you read this throughout the text, but the other one, of course, is when I say I, it's the most individual, personal reference, but anyone can say I, so it's the most universal. So, so I think like if irony is the structure of contradiction, then I think a good way of reading Hegel is to read him as an ironic thinker, because he is saying and unsaying things at the same time. He has double meanings to what he's saying. He is self-reflectively kind of framing his own discourse, but also going against that frame. And so there is this kind of frame that you have to think about when reading the text, which is how the author sees language itself, or how the author sees representation itself. And so he has a theory of language and representation, and you have to apply that theory, not only that theory to his own writing, but actually his practice to his own writing.
The other word would be Aufhebung, right? Like that seems to be also that's his key term, and that also means almost opposite things, to raise up and to cancel at the same time. So, but I think yes, but I guess I'm a little uncomfortable with the term irony, because I feel like everything you described is right about the way he has this double investment, but I think he's equally invested in religion and science. So I don't think, like, I think when you're being ironic, you're not invested in one side of the opposition, right? Like I say, like, oh, I love to eat meat. If I'm being ironic, I don't eat meat. So I'm not invested in eating meat at all, but I'm saying it. So I feel like that's why I don't feel like irony quite captures him, because he's equally invested, if for Geist, in the sense of Geist, like he like Heilige Geist is, he cares about that. And Geist as the zeitgeist, or the sense of the period, like he cares about that. So I guess if that's my initial response to that notion of him as an ironic thinker, that it doesn't really, I think you're right about the double meanings, but again, I think he's invested in both sides, so I'm not quite comfortable with the term irony for that reason.
Yeah, but I have to think about the relationship between irony and if when you're being ironic, if you are actually affirming both sides, or you're undermining both sides, or maybe
Yeah,
it means
maybe
the same thing. Because like, so have you read Richard Rorty's stuff on liberal irony?
yeah, yeah.
And so it's very interesting, that he ties the liberal to irony, and to this notion that the liberal basically realizes that everything is contingent. It's kind of like that we make our own social order. Even science is contingent. It's just rhetoric. And then he says, but the primary virtue or interest of liberals is the suffering of others, which I don't know where that comes from, but but it's interesting use of like liberalism and irony. And so I'm thinking about this notion, like the liberal subject is torn between these opposite things, like being a self, but fitting into society, and in fact, defining yourself through society. And so you have this, combination of opposites in the sense like, I'm focused on myself, but actually I'm obsessed by what other people think about me.
Right.
And actually my notion of myself comes from my identification with others. So like this idea of I'm an other for the other, which is kind of this double contradiction.
Yeah, I think too, don't you think that the obsession with what the other thinks of me is the return of the repressed collectivity? The collectivity is repressed in the liberal subject, and then it returns through this obsession with what the other thinks of me. That's what I would say. And I think, to me, Hegel is the great anti-liberal thinker. I know that there's this whole, today especially, there's this whole liberal Hegelian tradition, and which is basically a philosophy of recognition.
Right.
And I think he's the great anti-liberal because he always takes the collective as the starting point. And I think you can't have liberalism unless you take the individual as an isolated monad as the starting point. And I think that's the original sin of liberalism for me. And I think that's Hegel's point as well.
Well, I think like, what Lacan does is when he's criticizing ego psychology, and it's interesting, if you read his early, like Acres and his early text from the 50s, he's really constantly returns to what he calls like the ideology of happiness,
Yeah.
the American way of life,
American way of life, right.
and ego psychology. And his argument is that the post-war psychoanalysts who came from Europe to the United States tried to assimilate into American culture and created kind of a psychoanalysis of assimilation, and that ego psychology is a psychoanalysis of assimilation, where they wanted to be treated as professionals, they wanted to fit into society, and so they turned psychoanalysis into this process where you're supposed to identify with the ideals of the analyst and the reality testing of the analyst. And so there is this connection. His criticism of liberalism and of American liberalism, or is connected to his criticism of ego psychology, in that there's this focus on assimilation. And I'll tell you a joke, and you tell me how it fits excess and lack. And okay, it's not even a very funny joke. Okay, actually, I told this to my daughter last night, and she was just like, "When is it going to get funny?" I said, so,
okay, well, that's a good funny opening for the joke.
Yeah, that's the only funny one. Okay, so this Jewish guy wants to join a country club, but the country club doesn't allow Jews; it's restricted, right? So he spends a week and he just like follows around Gentiles and just learns how they dress, learns how they talk, learns how they walk. He watches them play golf, and he really like totally gets it down. And so he goes for his interview to get accepted to the golf club, and the committee says, "I'm sorry, but we're gonna have to reject your application." And he gets upset. He says, "Can't you see I'm a goy?" Okay, so like at the moment when he's trying to fit in or assimilate, he fails to assimilate. And so much humor is about like the failure of assimilation.
Yep.
And so I think like this whole like rhetoric of assimilation or assimilation, I think plays such a huge role in comedy, because if you think about it, so many comedians are from identified minority groups.
Right.
And part of it is, I'll tell you another little short story which relates to this. Sorry. I had a friend at UCLA who did stand-up, and he kept on telling me, "Oh, you got to do stand-up, you got to do stand-up." And I was like, "Okay, I'm going to do it." And then we're about to go, and he says to me, "What's your identity?" And I'm like, I don't know, I'm me. And he says, no, you have to have a recognizable identity. People have to immediately be able to stereotype you, else they're not going to know, like, how to like take your jokes. So you have to have a blatant recognizable like identity. And I thought that was so like interesting.
Yeah, very revelatory, I think.
In a way, but it is true. A lot of comedy is about, and Freud talks about this, like the Jewish jokes are a lot about someone with a recognizable like ethnic identity, showing that they're willing to mock their own identity group
Right.
for the audience, so that they're willing to sacrifice. So it's a form of assimilation. Like, I'm willing to sacrifice for the group, and I'm not going to stand out. I'm not going to be different. But then it always fails, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's great. I think that, you know, the notion of, just to bring it back to Lacan too, like I think that notion that assimilation is a betrayal of psychoanalysis, I think is really important. And what's interesting is that, unlike, so ego psychology starts with the individual subject, right? So, but what's fascinating about Lacan is he starts with the other, right? Like, so that the subject doesn't exist on its own. It's always subjected to the symbolic and to the other. And so I feel like that's what it's ironic, this is an irony, I think, of psychoanalysis, that it's the group that starts with the individual subject that actually betrays the individual subject. And it's Lacan who starts with the other, who actually arrives at and sees psychoanalysis as committed to the singularity of the subject. So I find that, and I think that's true of, I think that's something that Lacan and Hegel have in common, that that singularity comes not out of this immediate affirmation that I'm not, that no one's like me, that I'm isolated, but rather how one navigates one's position relative to the other and relative to the universal. So I think I like those. I mean, I think you're right that that assimilation is always a temptation for psychoanalysis, but a temptation to be avoided. Like, I think assimilation, for the reason you just said, even if you wanted to do it, it always fails. Like, there's no such thing as a successful assimilation. And this is, I think, to get back to Hegel, this is, I think, the problem with the turning Hegel into philosopher of recognition, that recognition can't be the panacea, because no one ever feels fully recognized. That the more you feel recognized, the more you feel that the recognition that you deserve is lacking. I think that's absolute truth.
So then how does Hegel point to emancipation? Like, how does we escape from the dialectic of recognition? Like
Well, I guess for him that if you grasp the failure of and this would be my claim for him, that if you grasp the failure of recognition, it's inevitable failure, then that's a way to disinvest yourself in the process of getting it, because you realize there's nothing to get. Like, I think, which is, I think, linked to this Lacanian idea that the big other doesn't exist, right? Like, there's no one. That's why recognition fails. There's no one there, no substantial identity that could give you recognition.
So it's interesting. I'm trying to trace this the notion of the other. I'm trying to figure out if it's Hegel, the first one, who used the other to represent, like the capital other, like Lacan uses, to represent at the same time. So the other means, it can mean society, it can mean language, it can mean the other person, and it can mean like God. And it can invoke these all at the same time. And so within philosophy, and you see this a lot in Sartre, the notion of the other being for the other and being towards the other, or this kind of the other represented on these multiple levels at once. And I was wondering, like, what philosopher, was it Hegel who first started using the term the other that way?
It's a great question. It's certainly not Kant. I think, as with so many things, I think it might be Fichte. I think it's Fichte who kind of is the first, because he's all concerned with how the subject constitutes itself as a subject. And it has to do it through otherness and through its positing of this thing that it isn't, which is the other. So I think he's the first one to really have a sense of das andere, the other, as something that's not just an individual other person, or even to use the other in any kind of philosophic way. So yeah, I think you're right that Hegel's right on the cusp of that, but I think he's getting that from Fichte. He's very influential. I think the influence of Fichte as a whole is an interesting whole unwritten kind of chapter in the discussion of Hegel. But I think it's him.
Yeah, and an interesting way to think about like the other is if you read Freud's Totem and Taboo, and he talks about like the stages of civilization. He's 3 stages: animism, religion, and science. And he says the primary or primitive stage of civilization, he says, is dominated by the omnipotence of thoughts, right? That's his
Mhm.
term, omnipotence of thoughts. But it is clear that like the thoughts are not coming from the subject, right? The
Right.
thoughts are coming from the other or from society. And so you have this notion what animism is, the reason why people in animistic cultures believe that everything is alive or they project their, he says, so on one hand, it's the projection of uh, human mental processes onto nature, right?
Right.
So that you see like things in nature, judging you or wanting revenge or, watching you like in paranoia or
Mhm.
psychosis. But so the interesting thing is, so on one hand, it is this idea of like we project our internal thoughts onto the external world, but those internal thoughts actually come from the social world.
Right. Right.
And so I think like, so for Freud, as you're kind of saying, I think it's an interesting way, like he starts off with the other, because if the primary way of thinking and the primary way of being, like he makes this equation between like the infantile, the psychotic, the dreamer, and the primitive culture, he says they're all dominated by this process of projection where memories are perceived as the perception of the external world, but they all have this like omnipotence of thinking or omnipotence of
Right.
thought. And but then so if that omnipotence of thought is actually the internalization of like the discourse of the other, then like Lacan's idea, like, oh, the unconscious is discourse of the other,
Right.
is like totally right. Like it's like
Yeah. Yeah.
obviously,
I think that's really good, and I think it's the problem I've always had with the not Freud's understanding, but the common understanding of narcissism as this the I. All I see is the I, and I feel like saying, well, and people obviously describe Trump in this way, and I'm like, he's the least self obsessed person I've ever met. Like it's the other completely dominates all of his thinking, and I feel like the way that he gets described as a narcissist really misses. I mean, I think you could do a proper psychoanalytic understanding of narcissism and then that wouldn't be a problem. But I think the way it's commonly deployed, I think it really misses the exact thing that you were just describing, this omnipotence. Like, to me, he's the perfect example of this omnipotence of the other in his thoughts. All he's thinking is what the other has given him to think. So I feel like we should complicate when and even like when we think of, I hear people talk about narcissism and Facebook or narcissism and digital media. And I feel like, again, that's not really what's going on. It's more like the other is totally like people have given themselves over to the discourse of the other, I feel like.
well, what I think people get wrong about narcissism, and I was recently talking to someone on a podcast about Trump, and she got on saying, "Oh, he's a narcissist." I go, "No, he's not. He's like the opposite of narcissist." Okay, so
Yeah.
narcissist is like even the narcissistic personality disorder. The notion is, okay, you constantly need to be validated by others because you have like no internal like validation, or that you're totally dependent on the feedback of others. That's why I think Facebook is kind of an example in the sense that it's people going online. Like everyone I see on Facebook, I don't have your Facebook, so don't worry, you're not on mine.
I don't have Facebook. I'm not on Facebook.
Oh, there you go. See, everyone on Facebook I know, like basically it's just like, this is the great thing I did, or this is the thing I'm outraged by. I want you unknown audience, to see, that I have these good thoughts and good intentions and what have you. And so I think it really is a good example of this Lacan calls, like the validation of the ego, the ideal of the ego, like that we want the
Right.
other. We see ourselves as lovable only from this point in the
Right.
other. And so, and Trump's not that. He doesn't want to be seen as lovable, right? I think Trump is a reactionary thinker. And so while there is this other, he wants to react to the other. And I think this relates to Freud's theory of the primal father. I think this notion that at first there was this, primal father who had access to all of the women,
Yeah.
right? And like Freud, I mean, Trump saying, oh, when you're rich and powerful, you can touch a woman wherever you want.
Right.
That's like, and Marquis de Sade saying, oh yeah, I want to have the right to touch, to do whatever I want with anyone else, this kind of universal law of enjoyment. I think
Right.
like, Trump is more of this like primal father, and that he basically, represents, I think also to a lot of his followers, like someone who's not freed, someone who has been freed from social constraint, right?
Absolutely. Right. I think that's
So a
absolutely
lot of what libertarianism is, and I think, so actually I'm writing a book called The Psychopathology of Political Ideologies, or
okay.
Everyday Political Ideologies.
Yeah, yeah, it's good.
So I'm trying to play on Freud.
Yeah.
Um, and and I argue like there's actually five dominant kind of political ideologies today, and 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 people often collapse them, and so there's two binaries like liberal conservative, but another binary is right left. There also is, I think, like I would say like a fifth possibility, which is like I would call universalist or globalist like politics. Okay, that's a whole nother thing. But what I want to get to is like the right, people confuse the right with conservative, but the right is fundamentally a reactionary movement, and in many ways, the right is a reaction to the left. The left attempts to reverse the social hierarchies of conservatives, and the right attempts to reverse, there's a
Right.
dialectical structure there, the left, right? And so it's a reactionary, and that's why they're obsessed by political correctness. They're obsessed by like government programs or taxes or government regulations, because the
Bob,
whole idea is, yeah.
do you know this film Bob Roberts?
Um, Robbins by,
Bob Roberts by
by
Tim
Tim
Roberts.
Robbins,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. But it's funny because he's like a reactionary politician,
right,
but also a folk singer, and he has
right.
this song that it's called "The Times They Are a Changin' Back," and I think it's a perfect example of what you're talking about,
Make
right? Like,
America Great Again.
yeah, right, exactly. It's the same thing, but it's great that it's in the form of a folk, like a Pete
Yeah,
Seeger folk song. But I think that's absolutely a perfect description of the way the right functions as this, like they see these leftist, like like the NBA players wearing the equality or
right,
something on
right.
their back. Like that's perfect. Like Trump's like, I'm boycotting, or well, many of them are. And this is actually, it's interesting. I was just reading a piece this morning that the NBA's ratings are their lowest ever. And this writer was theorizing it's because they're wearing these like Black Lives Matter ideas on their back of their jersey.
I
So
just heard that they were higher, like the opening week, maybe the opening days were higher, and then they've gone down. I mean, it's interesting, another like psychoanalytic thing is, and this relates to humor, is what happens when there's no like audience. Like, why is there a laugh track, right? Or why do we need the audience? And Zizek talks about, oh, is it because we're too lazy to laugh on our own? Or is it like we don't know when something's funny, we have to be told when something's funny? Or is it that we need like the social okay in order to laugh? And so we need that. But there is this notion of like the enjoyment of the other, because it's like we have a hard time watching like sports without the audience because we're not registering the enjoyment of the other. Like we can only enjoy through the other. And
no,
without
I
the
think that's
audience, we're like,
yeah, yeah. It's a great point. And I think it's true of all comedy. And I think that's why the laugh track, it's allowing us, it's giving us another to laugh with. And I think that's why people like to retell jokes, because they're like, why are they retelling it? They've already told it once, but they want to, they want, it's the enjoyment of the other that they're after. I think that's right. I mean, I kind of think enjoyment is always transitive. It's always has this kind of connection to the other, and it can't be divorced from that. So I feel like that's that comedy makes that evident for sure.
so yeah, I think a big problem I have is like then trying to figure out, what's the relationship between pleasure and enjoyment, especially because, I learned about like, a lot of Lacan's stuff when I lived in France, and
Right.
jouissance, which is translated as enjoyment, like the immediate first definition for French people is orgasm.
Right. Sexual. Right.
Yeah. But orgasm, not just like sexual enjoyment, but
Right.
orgasm.
Right. Right. Right.
So like, when you translate into enjoyment or pleasure, like that's lost, okay? But I mean, is that okay? Is it a broader thing when like Freud calls it the bribe of enjoyment? And he uses the word that actually is, I think, Fraude, like it's like related of joy. It's interesting. But he
Right.
says like in humor, the reason why I'm able to get you to not criticize me is because I'm bribing you with enjoyment.
Hmm.
Clearly doesn't mean orgasm, right? But he means
Right.
like I'm giving you, I think in this way, pleasure, and in exchange, you're suspending your criticism, right?
Right.
So I think this idea of enjoyment of the other is a really complicated term, like in Lacan, because he
Yeah.
defines knowledge as the enjoyment of the other. And I
I
just
know.
think that's a really, do you have any sense of like what that could possibly mean?
Uh, I don't know if I have a good idea of that. I mean, I think that that what he's getting at though is that there's no, and I think this is true. I mean, this is one thing I really like about him is that there's no immediate, that enjoyment isn't immediate, that it's always has to be mediated. And so I think that's what he's, and I think that goes against even that that notion of jouissance as orgasm, because it, that I think our clearest sense of, like, we think orgasm is just an immediate feeling, right? It happens immediately. It just happens. It's a result of the act, whatever. But I think it has to be that there's actually a lot of mediation by fantasy that goes into making orgasm possible. And so I think that to me, that's one of the most important things that Lacan has to say about jouissance is that how can we get us out of thinking about things as immediate and get us to seeing the way in which the mediation actually is always operative. And so to suggest that knowledge is the jouissance of the other, I mean, I think that seems to fit right in with that.
Hmm. Yeah. And like a concept I've really like been very interested in, and I don't know if you've dealt with this much, but like, I've, there's a concept of catharsis, like especially with Aristotle,
Yeah.
because, Aristotle, in a brief passage in the Poetics, defines um, catharsis and like art, or the goal of art, right, as the purgation or the purging of feelings of pity and fear.
Right.
And so it's this, actually, once again, it's kind of this reactionary discourse. It's not the production of emotion, but it's actually the purging of emotion, purgation, right? And some people say, well, in Greek you can translate that to mean like the educating of.
Right.
And I'm not sure, but I think it's very interesting when Freud defines the pleasure principle. He says the pleasure principle is all about escaping tension
Right.
and anxiety and conflict.
Yeah.
And so it's a form of release. And so you think of jouissance as a form of release, then I think you have this idea, well, what's a release from? Well, like for Freud, the pleasure principle, it's a release from tension, anxiety, conflict. And for Aristotle, catharsis is, the release from feelings of pity and fear. And I think like you think of the right, this of as being like driven by catharsis, this attempt to escape conflict, right? They don't want to deal with racism or class conflict or sexism or homophobia or Black Lives Matter or the pandemic or anything, you know, and this kind of and so their enjoyment is in part derived from and they also don't want to feel any pity, right? The purgation of pity. And so it's interesting, like that Aristotle says that like this is the kind of goal, the telos, the goal of theater is release and release from pity, which I think is.
Do you think, Bob, do you think the right really wants to be released from it? Or don't they love, I mean, you say they want to be released from conflict, but it seems to me like they love the conflict. Like if they don't have the conflict, they'll even invent conflicts to have with
I think
liberals.
some of it, I mean, there's this provocative element, but I think a lot of it is like when you avoid conflicts, they keep on returning. And like when you don't deal with things, you can't escape them. And so I think though, like thinking about Trump is like, um, I see him like as this kind of like borderline personality or, almost like I would say like sociopath, right? In the sense like this fundamental lack of empathy or sympathy or pity, right? The
Right.
fundamental like insensitivity towards other people or the suffering of other people that are not in his group. and this kind of instrumental, like
Well, even
amoral
the people that are
opportunity.
in his group,
What?
even the people in his group, I don't think because he doesn't, like, he holds the thing in Oklahoma. He doesn't care if they get the virus, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, he doesn't care about it's not like people in his group get more care than the people outside.
It's probably a mistake to have a sociopath as your president during like a pandemic. It's
Yeah,
probably
probably a bad idea. Yeah.
probably not a good idea. Like, it's probably never really a good thing to have a sociopathic president, but like during yeah. Because I remember I used to work in a court, right? I used to work with criminals and their families in the Bronx Family Court. That was like one of my first jobs after I left France, and I went to this seminar, and the psychologist was saying that, the problem with these people is, first it's wrong to say these people, but they all have low self-esteem, and I was like, I've never met people with higher self-esteem.
Right.
Self-esteem is not their issue.
Right.
Like, no, they're often like opportunists that are insensitive to the sufferings of others. Like, and so I think like sociopath, I think like I want to bring back like the sociopath as like a psychoanalytic category, and think about it like in terms of perversion and this kind of splitting of the self, but also just this notion that like someone like Trump, it's like the definition of borderline personality is like lack of impulse control, right? Polarization, splitting. So like either you move from idealization to debasement, right? People are either one or the other. And Freud's theory is like, he says there's certain men that need to split their love object, right, between the Madonna or the whore. Like they can only desire people they don't respect.
Yeah.
Or they can only desire women they don't respect, and they're impotent in front of women who they idolize, right?
Right.
And I used to have this patient when I was a psychoanalyst who was a criminal, and but also it's interesting. He belonged to all these like anonymous groups. Like he was in Narcotics Anonymous, but also like Spending Anonymous, but also Sexual Anonymous.
Wow.
And he would always infiltrate the group and then like basically corrupt his sponsor, right?
Okay.
And it was so interesting. But and he was constantly like, he would tell me, like, oh, this weekend, I had sex with like 15 different people, like of all genders of every. I mean, he was just like, there's no limits to his like enjoyment in a way. And it's weird because you're not supposed to have like perverts in analysis of it. But
right.
But he was completely like impotent in front of anyone who was taller than him, or he thought was better looking than him.
Oh wow.
Or that, anyone he had to look up to.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And he said like he could only have sex from behind, because if someone looked at him, he might feel like he's being judged. And I think that's such a great example of the splitting between, the ones you desire, the ones you love. And Freud's idea is like, in order to avoid incest or the mixed, complex, ambivalent feelings, or the mixing of tenderness and sensuality, there has to be this splitting off, right? And so I think like a key to like the borderline personality is this process of splitting, which requires this like splitting of the world between good and evil, or us and them. And I think, like in people like Trump, you see this dominance of this like impulsivity, this splitting, this insensitivity towards others, and this kind of like, just leave it at that. So I think
I was just thinking of it right along these lines, that Trump about a couple years ago said that he thought Snowden needed to be executed as a traitor. And just yesterday, he thought, I think I'm going to pardon Snowden because a lot of people like him. So it's like, I think that's a nice example of this idealization, debasement, opposition with the same person.
So that's where the conflict is generated, is in the chaos, right? This idea of the chaos of like radical, like hire someone, idolize them, next day they're fired.
Right.
And that they're so quickly to move from, or he loves, the North Korean leader one day, and next day he's going to bomb him, and then they have a secret relationship that he's going to bomb him again. And so there's no like and that's another like sign, of a borderline personality is like unstable relationships, right?
Right.
Because
Right.
swings from idealization to de-idealization like happens so quickly, and the
Right.
impulsivity of it, and then the kind of the lack of like any long-term like structure or commitment, because it's
Right.
just
Right.
wow.
Right. It's a bad idea. I like your what you said, Bob, that it's a bad idea to have them as president during the during a pandemic. That's for sure. I've had a lot of friends from other countries say that they've never felt sorry for me as an American until now. So
Yeah,
there's at least that.
right. Yeah, you got to be careful.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else you want to talk about or put out there?
No, we've kind of covered all my most recent things. So that's
You also have this website, so like not website, but YouTube channel with a lot of videos and stuff.
I do. I do a podcast too. We were
You do
talking
do
about
a podcast, really?
yeah. It's called Why Theory. I do it with this friend of mine named Ryan Engley.
Really?
Yeah.
And
Which you're
how long have
what
you been doing that?
what's that?
How long have
Oh,
you been doing that?
well, it's almost the third year. So
Really?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, quite a while.
Sorry, that sounds bad, but I don't know.
No, it's totally fine. It's just, but what you said is interesting because there's, like, I'd say the number of people that have contacted me about that podcast versus that have contacted me about any book that I've written is like, it's like 20 to 1. So it's like there's much more that has much more public, podcasts really today has become this thing that
Yeah.
every I do it too. Like I listen to podcasts while I'm taking a walk or lifting weights or whatever. So
But there
I
is a
get
certain ideology of like successful podcasts, not necessarily yours. I'm sure not yours, but
mine's not successful. So
okay, yeah, okay. So like this libertarian thing that I kind of pointed to is
yeah,
so part of it is like these guys. It's almost all white males.
right,
Most like Joe Rogan
right,
and Adam Carolla,
yep,
both former comedians, um, and it's almost like these guys feel like they're like they can talk about anything for any amount of time. Like many of these are like several hours. It's
yeah,
crazy, right? And it's like they feel like this is part of the libertarian thing and part of the free speech thing. They think that like nothing should limit their speech, not even time. Like it's just like these,
I know,
and that everything they say, it's interesting. Like Joe Rogan is one of the most successful things. He just says, "Oh, I'm just a platform. I don't have any political views. I'm anti-ideology. And I think part of that I can understand, but he still feels like entitled to say to comment on politics to a mass audience, but from this perspective of denying his own like investments or interests. And ultimately it's a money-making thing, and so
right,
it's not just like the pure um, discovery of truth through knowledge and research. It's this kind of commodified um, representation. And so I just think it's just an interesting, like social phenomenon, and that it's in fact that it's almost all men, and it's almost all white men, and they're almost always complaining about censorship and their victimization, and yet they're like the most powerful people, like
they really are.
imaginable.
Yeah,
And like even like Elon Musk was on the Joe Rogan show, and he said that people should be free to decide on their own whether they want to wear masks or not. It's up to them.
Musk said that or Rogan said that.
Elon Musk, did, Joe Rogan, like agreed with him, and
Yeah.
it's just like, and Joe Rogan just to move to, you know, um, Texas in order to escape taxes because he signed
I, I
$100
saw
deal
that.
with
Yeah.
Spotify. So I spend my time like listening to all of these podcasts. It's probably not good for me,
Well, at
but
least you
there
got
are
a book out of it, right?
certain points, certain things. But why did you start your or what's the audience for your YouTube videos? Like,
That's a good. I think I got people ask me to do that from the podcast. So a lot of it is an overlap of people, but I don't know. I just and You know what? You know when I started, Bob. So I put up a few that were just talks I'd given or some whatever, and then um, I to teach in the spring. I made videos, video lectures. Then I'm like, well, I could just put this out. And so I just decided to put them out. So that's basically how it happened. So if I wouldn't have been confined to teaching via video lecture, then I never would have done it. I don't think. But it just it just seemed like, why not just put it out there and see what happens.
And have you
And
gotten
so
feedback on them, or like are there?
yeah, I've gotten pretty good feedback. I mean, most responses haven't been totally hostile. Like most have been, thanks for putting this out there. But I did this one recently on why the right hates masks, and that got a little some fireworks started. So, and I just, Hillary thinks, my spouse thinks I shouldn't even allow comments. I should just, if I'm going to put them up, don't put it. But I kind of like to hear what people say, and I don't mind. I just don't respond if they're if they're negative, but thoughtful. Then of course I'll respond. But if they're just like, you're a dupe of the whatever, then I'm just not going to respond.
But what do you do when they start like saying like really racist and homophobic and sexist things on your comments?
No one's done that so far, but I would delete it. I would delete it. Yeah, because you can do that. You can just delete the comments. So,
Yeah, no,
yeah.
I think it's interesting that this has taken off, this kind of long form, or this kind of like alternative model for knowledge distribution.
I know. I mean, I think in many ways you're right that it's just a commodification of it. But I think there is this other aspect to it that is it's pretty good. Like people that are interested in ideas, but aren't going to go back to the university or whatever. Like it's a kind of area that you can look at things. So I don't know. I feel like like Derek Hook. I don't know if you know him. He's put up some videos and stuff. So I don't know. I feel like it's I don't know. I find them like when I mostly listen to ones in French and German just to kind of keep but I listen to stuff on Hegel and Lacan all the time. So it's not like I'm just producing. I'm also listening and watching to that stuff all the time.
So maybe like when I try to teach social media, I try to do this, but I always fail. Is I try to like, I call it like ambivalent critique. I try to like say like everything is good and evil at the same time. This is the contradictory, thing, and that like it's still really important to clarify what makes it good and what makes it evil. Like, so something can be like this kind of commodified libertarian discourse, but can also be its opposite, and that
Right.
we have to be able to like distinguish the difference and to make choices based on those differences. But we can't over idolize or devalue anything, because that fits into the whole polarizing borderline splitting.
Totally agree. Totally agree with that.
Okay, so let's end on the total agreement. And so,
Okay, great.
but I'll let you know when I put this up and how it's used. But really, thanks a lot. It was great to have a conversation with you. And
great. I enjoyed it so much. Great. I'll
yeah,
talk to you soon. Okay, take care.